Okay, well, hopefully this is working and recording as it should. We're going to do this view. We're going to do 100% full screen. Okay, and we're going to go to, of course, Chapter 3, which are informal fallacies. So what we'll be looking for in most instances after this chapter are formal fallacies. That is, we have categorical or hypothetical syllogisms that we need to then use what we're going to see are truth tables or Venn diagrams. I have a very quick and easy way to get through that chapter that I think is far easier than the one given to us in the book. And so you'll see that after this chapter, we'll take a brief pause from Hurley and then continue on, going back into Hurley and to look at what are formal fallacies and how we test for formal fallacies. But in this chapter, what we're looking for are informal fallacies. So we're going to cover 3.1 and then 3.2 today, at least in this recording. 3.1 is fairly short, right?
Section 3.1 introduces...
This section introduces the fallacy, which is a defect in an argument. Any argument that contains a fallacy is a bad argument. Conversely, though, and on the other hand, any bad argument is bad because it contains a fallacy or because it has one or more false premises. Okay? We'll get to this. Okay? Fallacies come in two kinds. There's formal and then there's informal, as you see on the screen. A formal fallacy is one that can be detected by examining the form of the argument. This will be much of our work in the middle of the semester. For example, here is a formal fallacy. All cats are mammals, all animals are mammals, therefore all cats are animals. As you should recall, if we've covered it in this course, from Chapter 1, this is, of course, a formal categorical syllogism, but it is also invalid, which is to say, it is a formal fallacy. Okay, so you don't even have to ask if all cats are animals or all animals are mammals and so on. It's an invalid argument form, right? As is formalized right there. By merely examining this form, you can see that the argument would be valid if the letters in the second premises switched places, right? But because you don't have in the original, you don't have that cross that you look for. In a categorical syllogism, for the most part, when you get that crossover, either from here or from here, then generally, again I say in general, you're going to have a valid argument form. Without even getting into the soundness of it or asking if the premises are true, we know it's invalid and therefore a fallacy, a formal one. Okay, and that's what being invalid means, being a formal fallacy. Okay, but once we correct it, then we have a correct and valid argument form, and then we go ask whether the premises are actually true. Right? All mammals are indeed animals. All cats are indeed mammals. Therefore, all cats are animals. Okay. To detect this fallacy is not necessary to determine what a cat consists of. We only need to examine the form of the argument. Okay? Again, another way to say this, we're checking to see if the argument form is valid or invalid. An informal fallacy is sort of harder to describe. It's a fallacy that can be detected only by examining the content of the argument. So if I could just pause for a second, what you're doing is you're not looking at the form of the argument, but you're looking at the content. Right? It's an informal structure. And we should say that a lot of the fallacies that you will see are ones constantly used in our political discourse, constantly used in editorials, constantly used in everyday life. It's just you don't identify them as fallacious reasoning. For example, consider this argument. A rhinoceros is an animal, therefore a small rhinoceros is a small animal. Right? To detect this fallacy, one must know something about rhinos. Even a small rhino could weigh over 1,000 pounds. And so now let's work through some practice problems involving the difference between formal and informal fallacies. As you note in the book, this is the shortest section we have done. Formal fallacies occur only in deductive arguments having a recognizable form, such as a categorical syllogism or a hypothetical syllogism. Okay? All A are B, all B are A, therefore all C are A. That might be one, that's a fallacy. If Syria renounces terrorism, there will be peace in the Middle East. But Syria will not renounce terrorism, therefore there will not be peace in the Middle East. Right? So this is a typical kind of argument. If this happens, then this will happen. This doesn't happen, therefore. Is this a formal or informal? Well, let's see what happens when we press on informal. Right? Now, this argument has a recognizable deductive form. And the argument is defective because the form is defective. It's not what's in it that's defective. It's the form of the argument itself. If S, then P. Not S, therefore not P. Okay? It's a formal argument. If we switch the premise, these two, then we would have a valid argument structure. Okay? So what kind of fallacy is committed in this argument? After taking one look at the stone in my new engagement ring, my gardener said that it was not a real diamond at all, a fake. Given this evaluation, I can only conclude that the stone is indeed fake. Okay? Now this is going to be an argument that we're going to see soon, which is an argument from weak authority, right? The gardener is not, as far as we know, an expert on diamonds, so we wouldn't take that to heart. So here we're looking at the content. Excuse me, I can't hit stop record, so you'll just have to suffer through when my throat gets a little dry. So it's not a real. So here we have to look at the content. We have to know what a gardener is, what type of person could, right? Note if something is a real diamond or not, right? So let's see if it's informal. Good. So to detect this fallacy, we must know something about the content of the argument. We must know that most gardeners are not experts in evaluating diamonds. That's fairly clear. Now, it could be that the gardener does have this background or something, and that we have evidence that's not presented, but as it is here argued, no, it's a fallacious argument. Some science fiction movies are thrillers, and some thrillers are well-directed production. Therefore, some science fiction movies are well-directed productions. Now, you can see how that's different from the previous one. Here, you see a very deductive format. This, then this, therefore this, right? So it's a categorical syllogism having the form that you see on the screen. If the word some were changed to all in all three statements, the argument would be valid. But it is a formal fallacy, which again is invalid. 3 players on our baseball team were interviewed by the press, and all 3 said they were registered Republicans. It must be the case that everyone on the team is a Republican. And you'll see this as soon as an informal fallacy. And that informal fallacy is a hasty generalization, right? Just because 3 players on a team that got interviewed by the press said they were Republicans, we know that a baseball team, a Major League Baseball team, for example, has 24 players on a 24-person roster. High school teams have between 12 and 15 people on the roster. But that's quite a jump from 3 players to the entire team, right? So it is an informal fallacy, which is hasty generalization. But to detect this fallacy, we must know, as the screen says, something about the content. We must know that Republicans and Democrats tend to be more or less equally divided amongst most groups of people. I don't think that's really what's at issue here. I think it's just a hasty generalization. One could imagine that in a very red state, as we say, that is a state that votes Republican, that we might have a team full of that. That's not the reasoning here. It's just the quick move from 3 to generalize for 15 people. Okay, that's the problem here. Okay, so it's not this is generally not the case, sadly enough, in our society, that there are huge, in some sense, America is often segregated along party lines in many states, right? In general, the majority of New Yorkers tend to be Democratic, whereas in Texas, the majority of the population at this time is Republican. Okay. We also must know that baseball teams have more than 3 players. So here, again, it's about looking at the content. Okay. So let's go through some problems. Right. It looks like it's going right back. So let's go back through the menu. Let's go there. Go back to informal fallacies. And let's look at actual fallacies. And then it'll become clearer to you what fallacies of, these are called fallacies of relevance. That is, somebody brings up something irrelevant that's not a part of the argument. These will be easy to spot. I think these are the easiest fallacies in the entire chapter. So the first one we're going to do is what's called, cool, let's hopefully it's a move. The fallacies of relevance occur when the premises of an argument are logically irrelevant to the conclusion. Okay? These are some that you see often. The first fallacy in the textbook is the so-called appeal to force. Okay? An appeal to force is where the arguer threatens the reader or listener to win acceptance for a conclusion. Right? In other words, here, obviously, this is a real appeal to force. But other appeals to force could be, you either agree with me or you lose your job. You agree to me, or I'll break off this relationship. You agree with me or whatever. Well, it doesn't mean that is irrelevant to whether the argument is correct or not. Right? You are using something irrelevant, the threat of force, to get the other person to assent to your argument. But again, it's irrelevant. Right? An appeal to force is irrelevant to whether an argument works or doesn't. Okay? But often this is used, right? That the threat of force is used to get people to agree with one another. Right? Get somebody else to agree. Okay? The threat may be physical or psychological, or I would even add economic. Agree with your boss, or you'll be fired. Right? The cartoon that follows illustrates the appeal to force fallacy. Listen carefully to see if you can find both kinds of threats. Hopefully I can get right past this. The characters in the cartoon are 2 college students named Mike and Tracy, right? And it's going to say something. Mike, I have to oversleep yesterday. I missed my psychology class. As a friend, you should lend me your notes for that class. Don't you agree? Why should I? That will only encourage you to oversleep again. Come on, pretty please. No. What if if you don't say yes, do you know what I'll do? What? Sorry to relive this very banal. On last week's test, I saw you looking over Deborah's shoulder to get some of the answers. I did nothing of the sort. Keep going. Yes, you did. And if you don't agree to that you should give me the notes, I'm going to tell her what you did. Again, it's an appeal to force. I was not looking over her shoulder, and if you don't take that back, I'm going to pick you up and throw you into the water. So in other words, you get 2 appeals to force, right? Okay, I take it back, so you weren't cheating. And then he says, that's better. So in some sense, they both are using appeals to force to get the other side to assent to their argument. One, he's making an argument not to provide the notes. She's trying to make the argument for him to provide class notes. But don't you agree you should give me the notes? Well, okay, here they are. Okay. So the first threat is psychological, and it's posed by Tracy. Tracy argues that Mike should give her the class notes because if she doesn't, she will tell Deborah, and so on. Right? That he cheated on the last test. The premise is logically irrelevant to the conclusion. Right? It's fallacious because her threat to tell Deborah is logically irrelevant to the conclusion that Mike should give Tracy the notes. That's the conclusion she wants to draw. But the threat of force is irrelevant to whether his argument leads to the conclusion Mike should give Tracy the notes, right? If she had said something like, I've lent you my notes from the past, and I'll continue to do that. I feel in fairness, you should provide the notes to me. That's an argument. But here, what she's saying is irrelevant, okay? Again, these are all fallacies of relevance. The second threat is one that's really physical. I'm going to throw you into the water. Therefore, I wasn't looking over Deborah's shoulder during the test. Again, whether or not he's going to throw her in the water doesn't provide for a conclusion that he wasn't looking over Deborah's shoulder during the test. He could make that argument with relevant premises, right? I think you are mistaken. In fact, I was seated nowhere near Deborah during the tests. Therefore, I wasn't looking over Deborah's shoulder during the test, right? That's an argument. But here, this is irrelevant. What I did by remaking the argument somewhat to get to this conclusion was to give premises that are relevant, okay? Mike's argument is fallacious because his threat to throw Tracy in the water is logically irrelevant to the conclusion that he was not looking over Deborah's shoulder. So now the next one is the one you might be giving me towards the end of the semester. This is the so-called appeal to pity, and this is one that is easy to spot. Officer, sir, this poor homeless woman rejected by family and friends can't possibly be a bank robber, even though it looks like we're seeing money bags right there. It's committed when the arguer attempts to support a conclusion by evoking pity from the reader or the listener. Okay? So this often happens at the end of the semester. Students will email me for why they should get a higher grade. And they'll often offer an appeal to pity. Indeed, I tell many of my students that they should keep an eye out for grandma or grandpa. They often become sick and ill in December and May. This is an unfortunate thing because then I get emails saying my grandmother is ill, and so on. Now, without direct evidence for that, that's obviously, so you should raise my grade. Well, there are things that you could do that are relevant to raising the grade and making an argument for raising the grade. But often students, not you, of course, provide an appeal to pity. And again, it's a fallacious, informal fallacy. I heard a sad story earlier today. Oh, my friend Paul, his little boy, was injured in a car accident. Oh, that's a shame. And a week ago, Paul's house caught fire. No. And it practically burned to the ground before the firemen arrived. Good Lord. And just 2 weeks ago, Paul's wife was diagnosed as having cancer. Oh, how terrible. And if that weren't enough, Paul works for a bank. And yesterday, the authorities charged Paul with embezzlement. What a charity. What a tragedy. Not a charity. The poor guy couldn't possibly be guilty. After all he's gone through, I would think not. Again, you see the appeal to pity, right? And the misspelling of guilty here. But you can understand why then, right? It's an appeal to pity. He gives all these reasons for horrible things happening to him and then says he could therefore not be guilty. Well, those are relevant. Those things are relevant to that, right? There are things in class, to go back to the class example, that are relevant. For example, if somebody has become deceased and there's evidence for that, the school does provide for an extra examination or ways to ameliorate your situation. Those are considered relevant by the university. But let's say you had an appeal to pity that didn't fit, right? I've always had a tough life. I grew up in poverty. Therefore, I really deserve an A in this class, right? That's an appeal to pity where those seem less relevant to what is going on than if you've gone through an illness or someone in your family has gone through either a serious illness or worse. So those are not necessarily, so some things are relevant, to go back to the class example, and wanting a good grade at the end of the semester, and some things are irrelevant. Okay, that is, they are merely appeals to pity. So Mike's argument is we feel pity for Paul, therefore Paul is not guilty of embezzlement. Notice the big leap here, right? Right? We're feeling pity for Paul, therefore, right? But this is irrelevant. Whatever Paul has gone through, this tells us nothing about whether or not he is guilty of embezzlement. Now, we could come up with premises, that is evidence, for why he could not be guilty of embezzlement, and that's exactly what the police and other authorities would be looking into, right? To provide evidence whether or not he was guilty of embezzlement. Because this conclusion is supported by nothing more than our pity for Paul, by arguing this way, Mike commits the appeal to pity fallacy. So the argument is fallacious. Subjective feelings about a person are not relevant to the claims that something is objectively true of that person. Right? In other words, in logic, we're looking for objective, valid, and relevant, objective premises, not related to our subjective feelings. Poor Paul might indeed be guilty. Okay. So the third fallacy listed in the textbook is the appeal to the people, and there's several types. Okay, this is one that is commonly used, and you hear it often. You hear it often in political conventions and so on. Everybody is supporting this candidate, so should you. Well, it's irrelevant, even if everybody else believes something, right? It doesn't make it true. If everybody believes that the earth is flat, it doesn't make it true. You need relevant evidence for that claim. Okay? To just cite one example, right? We know through history we have corrected ourselves about the earth's place in the universe, where most, if not everybody, believed that the earth was the center of the universe. We know that's not true, right? And arguments that say everybody else believes this does not make that relevant. In moral philosophy, this is even more important. Because in moral philosophy, just because everybody else is doing something doesn't make it right. If you lived during the Nazi period from 1933 to 1945, just because many, if not most Germans were involved in some way in supporting the Nazi government doesn't make it right. And in fact, in ethics, we learn that we often have to go against what the majority of the people believe. Okay? So just because everybody believes it does not make it the case. Okay? But there are other appeals to the people. Okay? There's direct and indirect appeals to the people. The direct form occurs when an arguer uses a mob mentality in a large crowd of people to win acceptance for a conclusion, right? Everybody here is in favor of this, and therefore you should be too. Okay? But again, just because everybody believes it does not make it so. Okay. The administration should let us drink beer on campus. Yeah, right on, right? In other words, you're using the mob or the crowd, even though there should be an argument here. Okay? All of us think it, therefore they should think it too. What do they think we are? A bunch of babies? Yeah, we're not babies. Administrators are crazy. We're grown adults. We have rights. We can do as we choose. If we want beer, we're going to have it. Beer, 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 beer. Okay? So this is a direct appeal to the people. Right? And now seeing this, let's get a six-pack and drink it on campus. Now whether one should have a dry campus or not is obviously something for debate, but what you want to hear is arguments on both sides. So the speakers created a mob mentality in favor of beer on campus. Mike uses this mob mentality to persuade Tracy to buy some beer and drink it on campus. Right? Right? In other words, all these people believe it. Why shouldn't we? But it doesn't follow from that fact, right? And we know this from the mob kind of arguments that were made by the fascists in 1933 to 1945, right? They drew crowds together and used that crowd mentality to get people to conclusions that for which they did not make arguments. An indirect form of appeal to the people, the arguer says, in that form, the arguer says simply that you should do so and such because everyone else is doing it. This is otherwise called the bandwagon argument. Right? In other words, everybody else. This is a form that you see most often, not the mob mentality. It's everybody else is doing it. Why don't you? Right? This is the old peer pressure approach. Right? Everybody else is drinking on campus. Why don't you? Everybody else is taking this drug. Why don't you? Right? Everybody else is on this bandwagon. Why aren't you? Right? Hey, Mike, did you hear there's a rock concert tonight? No. Absolutely everyone who's the least bit cool is going. You should go too. Wow, I guess you're right. Let's go. In other words, look at how this is irrelevant. Well, just because somebody's cool, a word I haven't heard in a long time, and just because everyone else likes that band or whatever, doesn't mean you should. You should be giving an argument. Who is the musician? Why is that musician important? Or why will that musician or band likely provide a good experience? Right? But it's irrelevant that everybody else is doing it. So Tracy's argument is that everyone who is cool is going to the rock concert, therefore Mike should go too. The premise is logically irrelevant, again, to the conclusion. Absolutely everybody's going is irrelevant to whether he should go. An appeal to the people, you don't want to be left out of the crowd, therefore you should do what the crowd is doing. Right? So now we get some practice problems relating to the first three fallacies. You really ought to vote for Jane Barker for state senate. Poor Jane has faced one adversity after another her whole life. She was born into dire poverty. Both her parents died when she was a child, and 2 years ago she was diagnosed as having diabetes. Now, which fallacy is being committed here? Right? Well, as soon as you start hearing about poor Jane and some adversity that they've been facing, does not mean that's irrelevant to whether she is qualified and should be voted on for state senate. Perhaps she's not somebody who agrees with your political views. Perhaps she's somebody who might be dangerous if she was in office. But these premises are irrelevant to that conclusion, right? So that would be clearly an appeal to pity, right? There's no discussion of force, and one could imagine there is an argument you really ought to vote that it's an appeal to the people. You really ought to vote for Jane Barker for state senate. And then it would say something like, everybody else is voting for Jane, right? That would be an appeal to the people. But this is an appeal to pity. The arguer tries to support the conclusion by evoking pity from the reader or listener. What fallacy is committed in this argument? Peter, certain you'll want to give me those tickets you have to the school play. After all, I know you don't want the student disciplinary board to find out you purchased your poli-sci term paper on the internet. Well, there's nothing discussed about how there's poor Peter or the person receiving the tickets is going through some sort of adversity, so it's not an appeal to pity. And there's no discussion about everybody else doing it. No, it's a threat, and so it's an appeal to force. Let's see this next one. Jane, I can't believe you don't have a cell phone yet. Why? Practically everybody today has one. Surely you'll buy one right away. There's no discussion of force here. There's nothing, although it's quite sad not to have a cell phone, but there's no appeal to pity. It's an appeal to the people, right? Everybody's doing it, therefore you should. Okay? So the arguer tries to support the conclusion by appealing to the listener's desire to feel united with the crowd. And this often works, right? We all want to be seen as normal. We all want to be seen as part of the crowd. We all want to be seen as part of, let's use this language quickly, the cool set or what have you, okay? But that doesn't mean that we should go along and get along. And again, that's really important in moral philosophy, okay? Just because everybody else is doing it or everybody believes something does not mean it's true. Okay. Now we're going to look at arguments against the person. This is Twitter. This is often Facebook. So somebody might give an argument that so and so is offering a bad policy, and then they'll say, and you know that a politician, he had an affair 10 years ago, so you can't support that policy, right? It's called the ad hominem attack or argument against the person. The argument always involves two arguers, right? The one being targeted, right? One who's making an argument and then it's just being targeted. I'm assuming that's what this cartoon means. The first arguer presents an argument about some subject. The argument is not attacked. Instead, what happens is a verbal attack, an argument against the person. Okay? So an argument against a person can be committed in three ways. It can be abusive. Again, Twitter. You are bad, so your argument is bad. But here's the strange thing about logic and what logic teaches us. Even the worst people, as long as they're following logic, as long as they're giving us true premises, can provide good arguments. Right? Now, there comes to be a difference, and I want to say this, that in politics and perhaps in discussions with friends and in our communities, obviously there can be arguments about a person's character. In other words, they've done this in the past. So if they're asking you for their vote, and they had previously, when they were a politician, been involved in various scandals, that's not an argument that is fallacious. That's directly relevant to what they're doing. But the ad hominem attack, it often happens against women and people of color. Just look at the comments pages under somebody making an argument for Black Lives Matter or an argument for feminism. Those arguments, you can make perhaps valid and sound arguments against them, right? Or if it's an inductive form of reasoning, you can make strong and cogent arguments against them. But just arguing that, well, you're a woman, you wouldn't understand these things, right? Or making racial epithets, as happens all the time on the internet, right? And in Twitter feeds. I picked those two examples because it happens every time, okay? So again, somebody's race or gender is irrelevant to the argument. In fact, a man can give, a person of color can support Black Lives Matter. Not of color can support Black Lives Matter. Or a person of, and vice versa, a person of color might not support Black Lives Matter. What matters is the argument, not a racist view of somebody or a misogynistic view of a woman, right? A man can give feminist arguments just as well as women, and indeed, many anti-feminists are indeed women, and they have to provide the arguments for why they are. Okay? Okay, so you're a bad person, therefore your argument is a bad person. And often that is takes place in the form of verbal abuse, but we see this on the internet each and every day. You know, the tax system in this country is really unfair. How so? The middle class pay all the taxes, and the rich pay practically nothing. But wait just a minute. Okay, so she's making an argument about the differences in taxes paid between the middle class and the wealthy. And he goes, how would you know? What? Are you an economist? Are you expert in the tax code? Well, no. In fact, you're completely ignorant about taxes, right? I guess not. So much for your argument. But notice there's two arguments. We're getting Mike and Tracy again. They're not very good friends, it seems. The middle class pay all the taxes, the rich pay practically nothing, therefore the tax system is unfair. Now, what we'd have to do is look to see whether these premises are actually true. Right? Mike's argument is she knows nothing about economics, she knows nothing about the tax code, therefore Tracy's argument is no good. Now, in some sense, obviously, those are relevant, right? Okay, if Tracy did know nothing of these things. But it is a fallacy that you have to be an expert in economics and so on to be able to know the different tax rates that the wealthy pay versus what the middle class often pays. Tracy's premises could still prove her conclusion, even if she knows nothing about economics. Right? That is about the tax code. Right? Now he's also going to say she doesn't know anything about the tax code, but an arguer's personal characteristics have nothing to do with whether a premise supports a conclusion. Again, always attack the premise, not the person. Okay? So let's examine the second form of the argument against the person. This is circumstantial. There's a second arguer, right? And then there's the argument. Okay? You are affected by circumstances, so your argument is no good. So, for example, this person might argue, we need a raise in the minimum wage, and this person says, oh, well, you only support that because you'd get a raise because you work on the minimum wage. Well, that doesn't refute that argument, right? Just because the circumstances of someone might lead them in a certain way doesn't mean that their argument is wrong, okay? Indeed, again, what you do is you attack the premises. Why do you believe that the minimum wage should rise, right? That's what you're looking for. The rich should pay more taxes in this country. Why so? Well, the rich are more able to pay. They have income from investments and a lot of other sources, and this is indeed the case. Just investments are taxed at a lower rate than wage earning. Okay, and then he says, okay, but the middle class, they have incomes only from wages. So this is well known. And they struggle every day to make ends meet. Aha, now I see what you're doing. Your parents are part of the middle class, right? What? And if the rich pay more taxes, then your parents will have to pay less, no? Well, yes, right? In other words, he's pointing out her circumstances, right? That she would likely have a tax cut if the rich paid more in taxes. But, pretty clever of you, right? He's basically saying you're only doing it for this reason. Rich people have income from investments and other sources. Those, by the way, again, are taxed at a lower rate than wage earned income, right? The middle class have income only from wages. The middle class must struggle to make ends meet. Therefore, the rich should pay more taxes. Now, what you do with each of these is you would go for the premises, not the person. Is it the case that rich people have income from investments and other sources that are taxed at a lower rate than the middle class? Is it true that the middle class have income only from wages? And is it true that many in the middle class must struggle to make ends meet? Right? If we can knock any of those premises down, then we'll see that the conclusion does not follow. Right? But knocking Tracy and saying, well, Tracy, you're personally invested in this, sorry to use that word, that's only pointing out the circumstances, which again are irrelevant. So obviously Mike's argument is, look, your parents are middle class. If the rich are going to pay more in taxes, your parents are going to pay less, and that's why we shouldn't believe your argument. Right? So you see how it's against the person, but it involves their circumstances. Right? In other words, Mike's premises have nothing to do with our argument. That's why it's a fallacy of relevance. Okay, and that's why. So this is why it's again an argument against the person, circumstantial. Right? He's not mocking her this time, but he's pointing to her circumstances and saying your circumstances are what lead you to believe that argument. Tracy's argument may support her conclusion even if she is predisposed to argue as she does. That's important, right? Just because someone gains from a set of changes doesn't mean that their argument is wrong. Okay? So the third form of the fallacy against the person is the tu quoque, which means you too. Right? The second arguer says the first arguer does it too. You're a hypocrite, so your argument is no good. Right? So say this weird guy with a mask was accused 10 years before of robbery. He makes an argument that robbery is wrong in society, right? Saying that you're a hypocrite because you did perform a robbery doesn't defeat the argument itself. Hypocrisy is calling somebody a hypocrite is itself a form of a fallacy. I know that seems strange, but what you're doing basically is whether his argument is good or bad. In fact, his experience having been a robber might lead him to help to look for evidence and to show why robbery itself is bad. Okay? I agree. Our tax system may not be the best. Why is that? But until they change it, everyone should pay what they owe. Why is that? Sorry, read that out of order. The tax code requires that we pay taxes, and the tax code is part of the federal law, right? Well, yes. And everybody should obey the law, don't you think? Yes. But now that I think of it, aren't you the one to talk? What do you mean? Last year you earned $5,000 painting houses, didn't you? Well, yes. And you didn't even file a tax return for last year. In other words, you got out of paying taxes. Therefore, your argument about taxes is wrong. But in fact, what she's indirectly doing is affirming the argument. She's saying, if it's bad that he didn't pay for the taxes, then in fact, actually, his argument, in some sense, is convincing to her. So much for your argument, right? In other words, even a tax cheat could be somebody who says the laws should be followed. In fact, one could imagine that having come to that argument, he might refile his taxes or who knows, but the you too, you do it, you're a hypocrite, is actually a fallacy. And that's often used in political discourse and so on. Right? So Mike's argument comes through here, right? The tax code requires this. The tax code is part of the federal law. Everyone should obey the law. Therefore, everyone should pay the taxes they owe. Okay? Okay? What you want to do is attack the premises. The tax code requires that we pay taxes. That is indeed true. The tax code is part of the federal law. That is true. This one, everyone should obey the law. This one we might want to argue about, given the civil rights movement and so on. There are times when we might want to say that people shouldn't obey the law. But in general, everyone should obey the law. Therefore, everyone should pay the taxes that they owe. Okay? And so this is a straightforward, valid, and perhaps sound argument if we find these to be true. And so you can't just knock that down by saying, well, you don't pay the taxes that you owe. I know it seems strange, right? But again, what you're doing is you're taking something personal and using it against that person instead of attacking the argument and its premises. Tracy's premises, again, are irrelevant. They're not about Mike's argument. They want to discredit Mike's argument by showing he's a hypocrite. You don't pay taxes, so your argument is no good. Now, Mike's argument premises could still support his conclusion even if he is a hypocrite. The fifth fallacy in your textbook is called accident. This fallacy is committed when an arguer applies a general rule to a specific case that the rule was not intended to fit. Right? Here, this should fit you. Right? One size fits all. In other words, this seems to be a general rule. Boy, I hate this one. This cartoon. It's a bit of fat shaming here. But obviously, this won't work. Right? You take a general rule. Obviously, it's not universal. One size fits all. Does not fit all human beings. Misapplies it to a specific case. This poor woman who's being terrorized by this guy. All right. Hey Tracy, 10 of us are going to barge into Bob's room and throw a party, but Bob is studying. You have no right to do that. Nonsense. The Bill of Rights guarantees us the right to assemble as we choose. Now, of course, this general right obviously is irrelevant to whether you can take up somebody's personal space, especially when they're studying. So Mike arguments the Bill of Rights guarantees freedom of assembly, therefore he and his friends have a right to throw a party in Bob's room. It's fallacious because the Bill of Rights does not apply to assemblies in private rooms. We have right to assemble in public spaces, but even that's limited, right? In other words, if you want to have a march or you want to have a large protest, often you have to get licenses and so on from the city in order to do so. Okay. So let's do some practice problems relating to the first three fallacies, right? Or at least the fallacies that we just covered. What fallacy is committed in this argument? The representative from China has argued that our trade policies violate human rights. But China's own record on human rights is abominable. China regularly executes prisoners just to salvage their body parts. That representative should keep his mouth shut. This is often used, right? Okay? So, it's obviously not an accident. We're not taking a general rule and applying it to all. And then we have to see it. Is it too quoque or an argument against the person abusive? Now again, they're saying you too are doing it. But that doesn't mean that the representative of China is wrong. So we have to look at the argument itself. Okay? So it's a you too argument, right? The arguer tries to discredit China's argument by showing that China is hypocritical in its attitude towards human rights. Again, when you see something like hypocrisy, it's the too quoque fallacy, or you too fallacy. People should be allowed to do what they want. George just broke up with his girlfriend, and now he plans to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. Clearly, we should allow him to do this, right? Now, generally, we do think that people are free to do what they want, right? But this is obviously taking a general rule and misapplying it, right? And that's called the fallacy of accident, right? The rule that people should be allowed to do what they want does not apply to people who are acting irrationally or out of emotional distress. Right? We wouldn't let our friends do that. Christine has argued persuasively that Congress should support stem cell research involving fetal tissue, but Christine has no morals at all. She has sex with any man who walks through the door, and she has had 3 abortions. No one with morals should listen to her. Right? This is obviously an argument against the person abusive. It's not an accident. There's no general rule here. And it's not about her circumstances. Right? It's about the person. Okay? The arguer attempts to discredit Christine's argument by verbally abusing her. Right? If you lend him $50, Bill promises to repay it in a month. But Bill has made similar promises in the past, and he has never kept a single one. Also, he's completely irresponsible when it comes to money. You shouldn't lend him a dime. Now, you would think this is an argument against the person, right? Why? Because if you lend him $50, right, you're saying Bill is the type not to. But this is an argument against the person, I think, where it's actually quite normal to reach this conclusion. If somebody in the past hasn't kept their promises, hasn't paid back the money, it would seem irresponsible, especially if they don't use the money properly, that you shouldn't lend them money. So I would go with no fallacy. But let's see what happens if I say it's an argument against the person abusive. Well, the arguer does not attempt to discredit any argument. Bill has not made any argument. Right? Too quoque? No, the arguer does not attempt to discredit any argument. Bill has not made any argument again, and there is no fallacy. The credibility of a promise does depend on the character of the person making it, just as in my discussion before about discussing a politician. Henry has just argued in favor of developing an anti-missile defense system, but did you know that Henry works for a defense contractor? Now it's clear why he argues that way. We shouldn't listen to him for a second. Right? So obviously this is something of a fallacy. It's an argument against the person, ad hominem in Latin, But it's arguing what? That based upon his circumstances, we shouldn't believe him. Right? Henry has just argued in favor of developing an anti-missile defense system, but he works for a defense contractor. Right? So it's basically saying his circumstances lead him to the argument. But what we need to examine is his argument. What are his premises, and do they lead to the conclusion? It's an argument against a person, circumstantial. In other words, he's predisposed to argue as he does. The straw man is also a very common argument. You will hear a substantive argument, and then you change the person's argument into something much simpler. That's why it's called a straw man, right? In other words, a straw man is easy to push over, right? In other words, if you can't attack an argument, substitute a new one in its place. This often happens, especially in editorials and so on. Right? The usual strategy is to make the person's argument look more extreme than it really is. This person supports less taxes for the wealthy, therefore, he's a right-wing hatchet man, blah, blah, blah. Or this person supports higher taxes on the wealthy. Next thing you know, we'll be confiscating the property of the rich, and we'll be a full communist society. Do you see how those two arguments have nothing to do with an argument for or against that kind of taxation, but in fact go to the extremes? Mike, I see that you got a C- on your last calculus test. Yes, I just don't know what's gone wrong. Well, you ought to be spending a little bit more time studying. If you would, I know your grades would improve. And you really owe it to yourself to get better grades. And think of your parents. They're spending good money to send you here. What are you trying to tell me? That I should spend 24 hours a day studying? Notice the extreme now he's built in. That's not what she's saying at all, right? But she's made the argument extreme. He's made the argument extreme, which shows actually he probably deserves that C, since he's making a fallacious argument. That I should become a complete nerd and give up my social life? That I should become a complete hermit and move into a cubicle in the library? That's what you're saying is, isn't it? No. Well, no human being can live that way. Everybody knows that. I give up. Okay. So, in other words, he takes what is a serious argument. You owe it to yourself to get better grades. Your parents are paying good money to send you to college. Therefore, you should spend more time studying. And then takes it to its extreme. Right? Same premises, but therefore I should be giving up 24 hours a day studying, becoming a nerd, give up my social life, and so on. She hasn't said that at all. Okay. As you see, no one should spend 24 hours a day studying, become a nerd, therefore your argument is no good. That's his argument. In distorting that argument, Mike is said to have thrown up a straw man, which he proceeds to knock down. He then concludes that he has won the argument. That's the sad part, is often when people use the straw man argument, they think they've won, when in fact, they've done anything but. Mike's procedure is fallacious because the argument that he knocks down is not Tracy's original argument, but a more extreme argument. That's why it's a fallacy of relevance. What he says is irrelevant to her argument because she has made no such claim. The seventh fallacy in the textbook is missing the point. Missing the point, the premises of an argument clearly imply one conclusion, but the arguer draws a different conclusion not implied by the premises. Apparently, she has no date for the prom. Okay, we'll get to this. My anatomy class is so hard, I'll never get an A. That's too bad. The only logical thing to do is blow the class off and settle for a D. Maybe so. It's missing the point. In other words, there are many more, there are other conclusions that one could draw. I should study more and so on. But she's missing the point of the premise, which is that she's not doing well and says, okay, well, I'll just settle for a D. So my anatomy class is hard, is Tracy's argument, therefore I should blow it off and settle for a D. The conclusion logically implied by Tracy's premises is that Tracy should continue studying, and maybe she can earn a B. Right? So in other words, the logical conclusion is not the one that she comes to. And that's why it's called missing the point. If you followed the premise to its proper conclusion, you would have a proper argument. But when you miss the point of the premise, you're led to a conclusion that is irrelevant. The conclusion that she should blow off the class and settle for a D is illogical. The next fallacy, and one that the students often find difficult, is called the red herring. An arguer diverts the attention of the audience by simply changing the subject. The arguer then concludes that he has won, or she has won. Okay? So a red herring here, obviously, as you take out a red herring, everybody's paying attention to that, not to the actual argument. Mike, I'm campaigning for Ken Larson for student body president. He's clearly the best candidate. He is? Yeah, he's very intelligent and a great speaker. And Ken really stands up for what he believes. Do you know what I heard about Ken? He has a crush on that sexy cheerleader, Debbie Wilcox. No, what? So that was put together in the age before Me Too, the Me Too movement. Yes, he's trying to keep it a secret, but Ken's roommate told me that Ken has written her dozens of passionate love letters. He does? Yes, and I heard that they were caught kissing in the hallway the other day. He has? And at the time, he was fondling her, and she goes, wow. Okay, but notice how he has now misled us from an argument for his worth as a potential politician on campus to one about his private activities. After all that, I think I'll vote for Sam Williams. He's clearly the better candidate. No. Oh. So the original issue is Ken Larson the best candidate? Now this looks like an ad hominem, right? But it's a red herring. Mike changed the subject, that's the point, to Ken's crush on Debbie Wilcox. Having diverted Tracy's attention, he concludes that another candidate is better. So in other words, he raises a new issue. Okay? So that you would be led to believe another candidate is better. Again, that could read too as an ad hominem. But what's really happening is he moves from one premise that leads to certain conclusions to a completely different set of issues, namely his private life and his crush on Debbie Wilcox. Such a procedure is fallacious because the mere fact that an arguer succeeds in diverting the attention of the audience does not justify any conclusion. This can be done by changing the subject to one that is subtly related but different, or to one that is naturally eye-catching, such as sex. Right? So you're changing to a subject subtly. That happens more often. You'll see that more often in the questions in the book. Okay, so let's get some practice problems in. For the last 3 fallacies, that should bring us to 9 fallacies in 3.2. So you argue that our car is too old and that we should get a new one. Well, speaking of cars, I saw an incredible crash on the freeway earlier today. One car was on fire, billowing huge clouds of smoke, and so on, blocking a whole lane of traffic. Well, so much for cars. Okay. So, is it a straw man? Is it missing the point? Or is it a red herring? Let's see if it's a red herring, because that seems to be what happens. Speaking of cars, I then go on to a different topic altogether. Yes, the arguer has merely changed the subject from buying a new car to the cars seen burning wrecked on the freeway, right? Whether or not you get a car or not, we are well aware, of course, of the dangers of driving, right? It's not a straw man because she's not simplifying the argument. She's actually just, or the person making that argument is simply changing. So after the accidental shooting, the gun owner said he was certain the gun was unloaded. The obvious conclusion is that even unloaded guns can kill people. Right? Doesn't seem that it's an accidental shooting, said he was certain the gun was unloaded. Obviously, this misses the point. Right? Why? Because this is not what follows. What follows from this is that the owner who thought it was unloaded, right, was mistaken. Right? If you said the obvious conclusion is the gun owner is mistaken, that would be a proper argument. But you missed the point. The point of this is not that unloaded guns can kill people. Right? The point of this is that clearly the gun owner was mistaken. Right? We don't. This is where we're looking at the content again of the argument. We know that unloaded guns don't kill people. Right? So it's missing the point. Right? The conclusion logically implied by the premises is that people can be mistaken about whether a gun is loaded or not. Now, another argument. We have just heard Allison argue in favor of legalizing marijuana for medical purposes, but Allison really wants all drugs to be legalized. Heroin, crack, cocaine, crystal meth, the works. That's her real argument. Clearly, this argument is crazy. Now, what's helpful here is that the person actually says, I'm switching her argument. There are many people that are in favor, obviously, of legalizing marijuana for medical purposes, right? And so not even for recreational use, but for medical purposes, right? That does not mean that, notice how he goes, he or she who arguing against this goes to an extreme. But Allison really wants all drugs to be legalized. But we've heard none of this from Allison, right? When you see someone go to an extreme, what is it? Straw man, right? The arguer distorts Allison's argument by making it appear more extreme than it really is. Johnny stole cookies from the cookie jar, and his mother wants to know if he did it. But the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution gives everyone the right not to testify against himself. Therefore, Johnny can refuse to answer. Well, presuming Johnny is a child, and this is not a court of law, this is where that applies. That is an accident. You take a general rule, the Fifth Amendment gives everyone the right not to testify against themselves, and misapplies it to presumably a child or an inter-family dispute. Right? It's an accident. A general rule misapplied. The rule against self-incrimination does not apply to questions posed by mothers to their children. If only that were so. You should see Orlando Bloom's latest action movie right away. Everybody in our fraternity is raving about it. Okay. Is it an appeal to the people? Is there no fallacy? Is there an argument against the person circumstantial? Well, this is what it's saying. Everybody in our fraternity is raving about it. Therefore, you should see this movie right away. But in fact, the fraternity could be wrong about this latest action movie being good. This is clearly an appeal to the people. Right? The arguer tries to support the conclusion by appealing to listeners' desire to feel united with the crowd. So let's see what fallacies committed in this argument. You ask what I think about Frank's argument that miracles don't exist. Well, Frank is an interesting guy. The other day, he dove into the pool at the sports center and his swimming trunks came off. He then decided he didn't need them. So he swam around stark naked for 15 minutes. All the girls in the water were screaming. Now, what do you think of that? Okay? Now, notice, right, we're not going to an extreme here, right? It doesn't say anything more about miracles. What do we get? We're getting a red herring. We're starting with one thing, and then we move off to something completely different, right? And that's what a red herring is. The arguer merely attempts to change the subject from Frank's argument about miracles, capitalized, to Frank's escapades in the swimming pool. Let's look at this one. Member to the jury, surely you can find it in your heart to acquit the defendant of burglary. This poor man has lived his whole life without the benefits most of us take for granted. When he was a kid, his parents never took him to a ball game, never gave him a hug, never picked him up when he skinned his knee, and never gave him a birthday party. Surely he is not guilty of this crime, right? And so clearly this is not an appeal to the people. We don't have anything in here saying something to the effect of everybody believes that he's innocent, therefore he's not guilty. We don't have anything like that. We don't have any general rule being applied. No, we're made to feel pity for this poor man, right? And so on, because of his upbringing, right? So it's an appeal to pity. Okay? The arguer tries to support the conclusion by evoking pity for the listeners. Barbara Jackson has presented lots of evidence supporting the idea that the stock market is a great place to invest your money. But did you know that Barbara is a stockbroker? So it's only a natural thing that she argues as she does. In light of that, we should dismiss her arguments forthright. In other words, they are saying that Barbara gains by having more clients if more people are in the stock market. But that doesn't have anything to do with her actual argument. Perhaps she gives a great argument for using the stock market as an investment vehicle, right? And so what you're looking at is the circumstances of Barbara instead of looking at the argument she actually presents. So it's an argument against the person, circumstantial, okay? The arguer tries to discredit Barbara's argument by showing that she's predisposed to argue as she does. So what fallacy is committed in this argument? Earth Day supporters say that pollution is killing our planet. Apparently our anti-pollution laws are not working. The conclusion is obvious. We should repeal those laws. Now look what's going on. Earth Day supporters say that pollution is killing our planet. Apparently our anti-pollution laws are not working. The conclusion is obvious. We should repeal those laws. Right? Now, there are two ways. There's no appeal to force here. So it's either going to be missing the point or straw man. Now, in straw man, what you do is you attempt to make it an extreme argument. Right? But that's not what's happening here. Earth Day supporters say that pollution is killing our planet. Apparently, our anti-pollution laws are not working. The conclusion that would follow is not that we should repeal those laws, which would lead only to more pollution, but perhaps increase regulation over various pollutants, right? So it's missing the point, right? But let's see if we put it down as straw man, that this changed the argument. No, the argument does not distort anybody else's argument. It's missing the point. The conclusion logically implied by the premises is that anti-pollution laws should not be enforced, right? Should be enforced, not be repealed. Sorry. So that's what's happening. Or at least that perhaps either that conclusion or an argument could be made for more environmental regulations. U2 is the greatest musical group performing today, and if you don't believe me, I'm going to get up out of my chair and smash your CD player all to bits. This one is the easiest one. It's the first one we saw. It's an appeal to force, right? I like to think that's easy, but if you have issues with this one, do let me know, as with any of them. And I hate when that comes out of my mouth because it turns out the things that I tend to think are the easier ones, sometimes students find the hardest, and vice versa. Okay, but this is an appeal to force, right? If you don't, I'm going to smash your CD player to bits. It's not an appeal to the people. It's not an argument against the person, abusive. Although it is kind of abusive, but it's an appeal to force. So let's see what the fallacy is here. Sylvia gave a speech arguing that guns have no place in the home. But I have it on good authority that Sylvia keeps a .38 revolver hidden under her mattress. Clearly, Sylvia's arguments are worthless. Okay? What is going on here? It's basically saying that Sylvia is a hypocrite. She's arguing against having guns in the home, even as she may have one. Right? Well, hypocrisy, or charges of hypocrisy, are actually fallacious arguments. And they are the two-quote fallacy. Okay? The arguer tries to show that Sylvia is a hypocrite who fails to practice what she preaches. A lot of people do this, but it doesn't make their argument wrong. To go back to moral philosophy again and ethics, it is often the case that none of us are perfect, and therefore we could all be called hypocrites at one time or another. Okay, bringing up things that I did as a teenager or in college or what have you does not, in fact, invalidate an argument I might give about, say, how my own child acts or other teenagers should act. Okay? So that's, again, when you see any charges of hypocrisy, tu quoque. That is U2 in Latin. Okay? And, Zephyr Construction Company should never be given the job of designing the new bridge over the Big Canyon. In recent years, this company has designed 4 of the bridges, and all 4 have collapsed. The company is clearly incompetent. Now, you might think this is an argument against the person abusive, right? Because it's saying something bad about the company. But the fact that they have designed 4 bridges, all 4 have collapsed, is directly relevant. So this isn't a fallacy of irrelevancy. This is very relevant to the job that they're being asked to do. There is no fallacy, right? The fact that 4 bridges have collapsed is an excellent reason for not hiring Zephyr to design the new bridge. Amanda has argued that cloning frogs in the biology lab is unproblematic, but cloning has serious ethical implication. Suppose you or I were cloned. Would that clone have rights? Would it have a soul? These are deep problems. We can only conclude that Amanda's argument is misguided. Okay? So, we see what's happening here. There are indeed, and there are these kinds of arguments, that once we start cloning frogs, then we might clone human beings. But this makes it extreme, right? And that is the calling card of the straw man argument, right? She's not making this argument at all. She's not gotten into the ethical implications of cloning humans, only about cloning frogs, okay? So that is the straw man fallacy. The argument distorts Amanda's arguments about cloning frogs by extending it to the cloning of humans. Now, no doubt, when we were cloning first began of animals, there was worry about its serious ethical implications. But nobody was suggesting that the argument for cloning at that time should be stopped simply on the basis that one day we might do it to humans, right? Jason has argued that the price of prescription drugs should be regulated by the government, but look at the facts. Jason has no college degree, he knows nothing of economics, and he's a complete ignoramus. Certainly, his arguments are trash, right? Now, see how this is all irrelevant to whether or not the price of prescription drugs should be regulated. So it's not no fallacy, because again, this is irrelevant. It's not a straw man, because it's not changing the argument. It's an argument against a person abusive, right? The arguer attempts to discredit Jason's argument by verbally abusing him. Okay? And those are our fallacies of relevance. If you have any questions, do let me know. Again, we will be looking next time at an extra set of problems, but we have gone through the first 8 fallacies given in the chapter. And if you have any questions, again, email me and so on, and we can either meet virtually or in person to discuss them. Thank you.